Chess Diagnostic.
Hello everyone, and welcome to 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. We're on day 18, part 18, and today we're going to look at discovered attack. Now, we did look at discovered attack earlier, but we looked at simple positions. Today we're going to look at more complicated advanced tactics that feature discovered attack and how it combines with other motifs, as well as just integrating a four-part thought process to finding every single possibility and move systematically. So in this position, it's white to move. If you want to pause it, you can try to solve it now, but we're going to go right ahead. So for white, we're looking basically to expose black to this battery. Now notice, of course, we have our bishop that we can move, either to bishop to c5 or take a pawn, and we also have our rook on the 7th rank. So these factors should immediately stand out to you because black, his king is sitting in the center, and his rooks are on the last rank and are quite passive, and his queen is sitting here undefended. Now normally the queen, you don't have to worry about them being undefended, but because we have this strong battery on the e-file, black is going to have some problems. Of course, we can see from step 1, black is threatening the a-pawn, but we're not really worried about the a-pawn. If we move to step 2, our candidates are bishop to c5, bishop takes pawn, as well as rook takes e7 check. There's really no move for the queen, knight's covering there. We could try to bring the queen, but that just makes it less active by putting it on the side. There's no move for this rook, the king, or any pawns really. So pretty much we've whittled it down to 2 moves, rook takes e7 and bishop to c5. So if we start calculating, we'd want to start with rook takes e7. Now, if the king takes, then of course we have this discovery and we win the queen. Even if the rook comes up, we can take the queen because the rook is pinned. So that's a winning variation for white. Now, if the queen takes, then we actually are just down a rook, because if we try to bring our bishop here, then the queen can actually take, and the king will escape either way. So now we're down a rook, and black is actually threatening mate here. So you should also notice that in this position, even though we have a strong position, we still have a back rank weakness of our own, so this feature should stand out to you as well. So we're still on step 3. If we bring, what about bishop to c5, then you notice that there's 2 captures here. There's queen takes e2. Now, if the rook takes, then again, as we mentioned before, we have a back rank weakness of our own. We'd actually get mated. So rook takes queen can't be done. But we also have rook takes e7. Now there is bishop to e7, but it's not a check, so that doesn't work. But rook takes e7 actually is kind of an x-ray attack because the king can't take because the bishop is covering the rook. So the queen's forced to take, and then we get this rook takes e7 mate. Now notice it's mate because these rooks are completely cutting off the king as well as just sitting there passively. Another drawback of having inactive pieces. So if we look at the initial position, if black wants to prevent mate after bishop to c5, the only way he can do it really is by playing rook to d6, which is just a horrible move. Now notice the queen can't take, so we can actually win a piece there. We got checkmate there if he takes. And black just pretty much has to give up every single piece here. We win the queen, we win another rook. This is the computer lines here, so it gets kind of ridiculous. And there's mate in 3 from this position. So it's interesting how we ended up with almost all the material at the end in that position if black wants to prevent mate. And it's all stemming from the fact that black's king is sitting in the center as well as his inactive pieces, plus our strong ones. All right, we're going to move on to position 2, position featuring Susan Polgar, and it'll be white to move here. All right, I'll see you there. Alright, so position 2 here is white to move, and you can pause the video now. So in this position, we can see that with white to move, that we have multiple options for a check. We have queen takes rook and queen to f6 check, supported by the pawn. We also have, well, from step 1, black is threatening the rook. You should notice that. We can take the knight, but we want to look at the checks first. We also have this capture with the pawn, but notice that your rook is hanging otherwise. So we'll look at the most forcing moves, all the checks and the captures first. The checks for queen takes rook, you'll notice that after we take the rook, the king is sitting on a discovered check. The pawn's covering here, so once we take, the bishop is supporting this pawn, and the king has to move back. The only other move at this point for a check is rook check, and now the king has to move back. Now we would love to play just g7, and of course the bishop is supporting the rook, so the king can't take. But unfortunately it doesn't work because the rook can just move, and then if he checks, actually the rook would move here. If he checks, then we'll just take the pawn, and eventually we'll escape here. So that's actually a losing variation. So pawn takes f7 check works because if the queen takes, then it looks like we're actually going to be up a piece, because at the end of the variation we can take that knight. Now what if the knight takes here or here? Now he's threatening our rook. We can just check, and then we would win back a piece, so he would actually have to take with this knight. But then we have check, and then either we can cut the king off, or we'll just check him because the knight was threatening our rook. And you can count that even though black has 2 more pawns, they could be dangerous. We're actually up a rook at this point, minus the 2 pawns, and it's going to be very difficult for black to do anything. Now we'll probably win even more material, or force a trade and simplify. So queen takes rook actually does work, but we also want to look at queen to f6, see if we can get mate. So if the king comes here, then actually we have a check, and that's actually quite bad, because for black at least, because he would be forced to move or take here, and we'd win a lot of material. But he doesn't have to move there, he can just move back. And now if we take, he has 2 options. He can either take with the pawn, threaten our queen, or he can take the rook. It looks like, though, if he takes with the pawn, that he's actually threatening our queen, and we'll have to do something about it, so we'll drop this rook. Of course, we can trade off both here, but at the end of the line, we're actually down material, so that doesn't work. Queen to f6 doesn't work, so we can scratch that. Now what about pawn takes? If he takes the rook, you can see that we're actually not doing too, we're not winning here, definitely. The computer's saying it's equal, which is not what we want. So we're going to look one last time at queen takes h6. So if we take the rook, we know that it's mate, but we want to make sure, since we're sacrificing a queen, definitely. So you'd visualize all these final variations, And at each step along the way, when you're doing a blunder check, you'll look at all the possible forcing moves, and you'll try to keep in mind what black is threatening at each move, and see if our threats take precedence. So and this is actually quite simple. Even though it's a lot of moves, each one results in a check. Check, and then there's 2 moves here. Now, of course, you want to keep in mind that the bishop's protecting the rook, so we don't have to worry about that. But there's actually 2 moves here. There's queen takes, which we analyzed. We'll just take, and then we'll trade and be up a rook. But there's also rook takes. So we don't want to miss moves like these, because these can be where you make errors in your calculation. So we can take, but then that's actually a disadvantaged trade because we'll be down a rook for a queen. But we also have this check here. Now the rook is forced to come back down, and then after a trade, we're still up a rook. So that would be your blunder check in step 4, and I hope that helped going through pretty in depth here. I don't want this to get too long, but if you have any questions, just let me know. We're going to move on to position 2. All right, in position 2, it is white to move, and you can pause the video now. All right, so if we go from the beginning of this position, of course, we're looking at discovered attacks. That's the one drawback about studying tactical puzzles, is if you know the tactical motif, then you know where you're going. But still, as I've mentioned many times, we're not just training a tactical motif, we're training the thought process to deconstruct any position. And that's what you want. You want your thought process to be comprehensive for strategic, opening, middle game, and end game positions. So in this specific position, you'll notice that it looks like the knight is pinned to the queen, but even though we're in a discovered attack, there are multiple threats of forks, specifically knight forks. So this is a good position to practice your knight fork patterns as well. Now, that's why these positions are combinations, because we're combining earlier simple motifs with deeper ideas and how to solve them in the end of the line. So if the knight takes here, then of course rook can take the queen, but you'll notice that we're threatening to take the black queen with a check. Now, why would we do this? Can't he just take? Well, he can, but then we'll sacrifice our queen. Actually, we didn't sacrifice, it's just taking 2 rooks. And the knight's covering this square, so the only other move is, well, actually the queen can come back, but then we'll be up an exchange, plus a pawn, it looks like. So that's totally winning. But if he tries to avoid that, then what do we do here? This is a pattern that you should be very familiar with. There is a rook check, and once the king takes, we have this formation, this knight fork. Now, if he moves there, of course he'd move here, because now we're threatening this pawn. If he moved here, then we'd actually get another fork, winning another pawn. So he's going to try to avoid that if he sees it. Okay, so if we can take this knight, of course we know that that's not good, because then we don't have the fork. So pretty much that's the only candidate. There is a threat here, but it's actually not a threat, because then the queen would just threaten the knight, and then we'd have to move back. So that's not even a real threat. The pawn can chase the knight, but then the knight would just take, and then we'd have a weak pawn. For example, this. Now, actually, black has a target, so you want to try to prevent weaknesses. So I'm just looking through candidate moves that you might have considered that are bad. Of course, the knight can threaten the queen, but it doesn't really do anything because our threats take precedence. So we've decided on knight takes d5. So after you've decided on this candidate move, you're going to want to look at the strongest response for black. Now, in step 2, when you're looking for candidates, you're looking for your strong moves. But when you go into step 3, you want to be very objective in your calculations to find what black can do to screw you over, basically. So we know that if the rook takes, we have the knight takes with check and we win a rook. So what if black just moves his queen? What if he moves it here? Then what happens? Notice now our queen is protecting the rook, so we can't take it because at the end of that line, although actually it could still work because there's a fork. Let's see here. Yeah, he could just take with the rook. Now if we take here, there's a fork, but the queen doesn't have to take. And now at this point, we're threatening the rook, and this knight is still under attack. So that doesn't work. So do we just move our knight? Do we just move it back? Well, we don't just want to win a pawn. We still want to look for all the checks. Your understanding of activity should have led you to consider another check. So what about knight check? That actually just gets the queen back to where we want it, because otherwise we're going to win an entire rook if the king just moves. So the queen has to take, and now we end up with that same position where if the king moves, then we have rook to h8 and then a knight fork. And then of course we're probably going to pick up some pawns, and we have a rook versus 2 knights, and we're just going to push these passed pawns. We're going to create a passed pawn, and it should be smooth sailing from there. So if we look at this initial position, you can see that your thought process actually makes your work a lot easier because it's systematic, and your understanding or your strategic understanding of activity should lead you to these ideas that cut down all your work. We know that from step 2, you're looking for all the moves that are forcing something, a check, a capture, a threat. You can see that there's no checks, and so the only capture is knight takes d5. Well, here as we analyzed, but that doesn't really do anything except drop a queen. Alright, so I hope this was descriptive enough. If you have any questions about any of these positions, just leave it in the comments and subscribe to follow along for 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. I'll see you in day 19.
Chess Diagnostic.